Senior political correspondent at Puck News, Tara Palmeri, tweeted yesterday in response to the FBI's Mar-A-Lago raid. There's always a Jeffrey Epstein angle. Bruce Reinhart, the magistrate in West Palm who signed off on the warrant to search Trump's Mar-a-Lago, left the U.S. Attorney's Office to represent Epstein's staff, his first sex trafficking case.
Palmeri also wrote Epstein's victims named Bruce Reinhart in their Crime Victims' Rights Act case against the government, accusing him of using inside Justice Department info when he switched sides to work for Epstein. Palmeri, who is also the host of Dr. Delirium and the Edgewood Experiments, joins us now to discuss. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. So what we all want to know is, what should we make of this connection here to Epstein, and is there anything to read into that, or is it just a kind of funny or unfortunate coincidence?
It's interesting. So yesterday I woke up in the morning and I read what everybody else did about who had actually signed off on this warrant, Bruce Reinhart. And all of a sudden a light bulb went off in my head because, as you know, I hosted 2 podcasts on Jeffrey Epstein, Broken, Seeking Justice, and Power the Maxwells. And they really dug into the Palm Beach case and all the corruption around it. A big advantage that Jeffrey Epstein had was that he had so much more money than the victims he was up against, right? Well, really the government, who should have been prosecuting him. And he hired a ton of people from inside the government to represent him. And at the time, I remembered that Bruce Reinhart ended up becoming one of his lawyers. He worked for the Southern District of Florida that was prosecuting him for this sex crime case in 2008, and that was the sweetheart deal that we all remember, where he spent time in county jail half the time on work release, really didn't serve any time for the crime. Now, this isn't to say there's really any connection between the two, but I remember, wow, Bruce Reinhart is back in federal government, and he was, just so happened to be the person who signed off on this warrant. I know I have really dug right deep into this Crime Victims' Rights Act case that the victims signed against the government because they were upset that they didn't know about Epstein's sweetheart deal. They didn't know there was a plea deal. They felt like this was a huge injustice.
Wow.
And I remember also that they named him in their suit. They felt like it was unfair that Epstein, with all of his wealth, was able to take, civil servants and hire them to represent him. And there's no proof that he took any inside Justice Department information, but ostensibly, if you're working for the other team and then you get bought to play for the other team, a few things that, so I'm not saying there's any direct connection, like Epstein, told him to raid this from the grave or anything, but there's history there with Reinhart. And I think anybody who's ever worked with Epstein in some capacity or has some connection with him, including our former president, Donald Trump, he was friends with Jeffrey Epstein. It's always going to be kind of a black mark that you have on you.
And there were no ethics violations, illegal requirements, moving from civil service to help Epstein and then, back to being a magistrate. There was nothing legal being violated there?
I don't think so. I mean, it's hard to say. The victims tried to point it out to show that they felt like the government was unfair, that Epstein had somehow bought everyone out. And I think if you listen to the podcast, you'll just see how he had literally hired, if he couldn't hire people inside of the Justice Department, he hired all of their friends, like Ken Starr, who was his lawyer at the time, and had, contacts all the way at the top of the chain to the top of DOJ. And that's how far up his case went, all the way to the top. And I think the bigger story about Jeffrey Epstein is how much money can impact the Justice Department, and how if you really have the resources, you can get a sweetheart deal in what is a pretty clear-cut case of a guy who recruited so many young teenage girls for sex. And it's despicable, but with enough money, you can hire some of the best lawyers in the world and have inside access to everyone who's investigating you.
Yeah, Tara, this is what's so interesting about the posture of this. A lot of folks who are defending Trump are raising this connection in a really kind of flat way to say, this guy is obsessed, this magistrate judge is associated with Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein's a bad guy, therefore we just shouldn't trust the judgment of the magistrate judge. And they're not making the connection that Trump has also been accused of sexual misconduct, that he also had a relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, that he is also an affluent person, the likes likes of which typically is able to have their money work in their favor in the context of these kind of prosecutions. So what do you make of how the connection between Jeffrey Epstein and the magistrate judge is being kind of weaponized by conservative punditry right now?
Yeah, I thought about that before I tweeted it and pointed it out. It was like, is this going to be used in some sort of conspiratorial way? I don't think there's a conspiracy there. I just think the guy worked for Jeffrey Epstein and he left the Justice Department to work for Jeffrey Epstein. That's a really big asterisk to have on your resume. I don't think, I spoke to someone yesterday about it who I know knows Bruce Reinhardt, who is an attorney, the state attorney in Palm Beach, Dave Ehrenberg. And I asked him, what do you think of him? He said he's thorough, he's extremely meticulous, fair, hardworking guy. But at the end of the day, this is something that like Bruce Reinhardt will always have to live with. I mean, he accepted money from Jeffrey Epstein at some point in his life. And by the way, Donald Trump will forever have to live with the fact that he was friends with Jeffrey Epstein, was regularly at his club, had been at Jeffrey Epstein's house before. They were friends until they weren't. And it wasn't really over the girls that was the reason that their friendship broke up. It was over the fact that I think it was over a property dispute in West Palm Beach. They wanted the same piece of property. Well, it wasn't over the crime that they're not friends anymore. It was over a real estate transaction.
Yeah.
So, and I think it's also just a reminder of like how and I think to me, I'm like, wow, there's always a Jeffrey Epstein angle. Whenever you talk about the highest echelons of power in our country, there is a Jeffrey Epstein angle. Literally no one. It's almost like no one goes untouched in that story.
Well, of course, Donald Trump has, said post the warrant and post the search that they broke into a safe, and that, of course, led some people to say, well, were they looking for the little black book? Did they find the little black book? And that's obviously conjecture, but I'm curious, what your insights are about why we don't have that little black book, why that seems to be such an inscrutable aspect of this whole thing, and whether or not there is some basis for conspiracy thinking about there being so many rich and powerful people involved that we'll never get to the bottom of who the client list is and that kind of information.
Right. Well, we definitely have Epstein's little black book. And that was pretty much the list of almost some of the most powerful people in the world. Well, I think a lot of the victims who I still stay in touch with are really disheartened. They were worried, though, last year, too, that nothing would happen to Ghislaine Maxwell. They want the government to continue to prosecute the Johns that were named, some of Epstein's very powerful friends that they say took part in the trafficking ring. Now, that's a totally separate issue from Donald Trump and what was in his safe, right? I think we don't know, really. And that's the problem, is there's a vacuum. And because of that vacuum, you've got these conspiracy theories that are flying around, and the right that supports Donald Trump, they're using that to their advantage. They're creating narratives where there really aren't any right now. There are facts. The fact is that this guy, Bruce Reinhardt, left the government to work for Jeffrey Epstein, and the victims of Jeffrey Epstein called him out on it in their lawsuit against the government, right? And then there are things that there's no connection to right now, and we don't know. And there may be no connection at all. And that vacuum created by, the Justice Department, by not being able to say what they're looking for because they're in an ongoing investigation, it's going to be filled by conspiracy theories, people pointing out some things that are tangible facts and trying to draw them together. I don't think Jeffrey Epstein is doing anything from the grave in this story. It just happens to be something that he did. It's a question mark on Bruce Reinhardt's character, but at the end of the day, if there's a warrant, I don't think his prior work with Jeffrey Epstein is going to impede on what he thinks is the right thing to do in terms of signing off on a warrant that's been prepared for him.
Well, right, from the grave, having influence from the grave is one thing, but I was somewhat shocked by the influence he continued to have after the initial conviction, right? After the initial, right. I mean, he got a sentence that was far too lenient and he was released, but still on paper, these very disgusting sex offenses, and then is able to kind of go right back to his wealthy influence peddling and connections to famous people for a period of time before then it all comes crashing down again. So, if he was able, to command that, even that is impossible to believe to some extent. So that's why isn't that why the kind of conspiracies or how could this be keeps coming up, because even what we know as fact is so wild. I
would say so. I mean, after committing a crime like that, you would think that you would be in the outskirts of society,
Persona
never
non
to be
grata.
seen again. You should be in prison, frankly, for the rest of your life.
Yes,
Like you
yes.
shouldn't even be able to have dinner with Prince Andrew afterwards, right? Like that should not be an option in life. But that is the class injustice that we have in this country. And I think the fact, I write about this in one of my pieces about the women who helped Jeffrey Epstein. It's like so many of them allowed them back into their homes and into their social circles and propped them up, some of these very powerful, influential women. And in a lot of ways, that gave him credibility in social circles. They're like, well, she's, one of the most connected publicists in town, Peggy Siegel, for example, who worked with Harvey Weinstein, all these Hollywood moguls, and she's throwing parties for Jeffrey Epstein, or she's inviting him on his invite list. So he must be okay, right? Some people I know said, well, he didn't really serve that much time, so the crime must have not been that bad. Well, actually, what really happened was that he was able to influence that outcome with all of his money and all of his resources and the team of 15 different lawyers who had connections to every person in the Justice Department handling that case, including people who worked in the Justice Department that he hired. So it's just one of the injustices. Like it's people in this country, it's actually like a disease that we have.
Well, Tara Palmeri, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And we'll have more Rising right after this.